denials, all the events, all the words of his denial between the 4 Gospels, I went through and I organized to help me figure out whether or not it is possible to combine them. And it is. It's just difficult. It starts out with John takes Peter in. Matthew, Peter went in, sat with the servants. Mark, he sat with the servants, warmed himself by the fire. Luke says, when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were sat down together, Peter sat down with them. So that's actually his action of sitting, not his action of coming in. John, I know 18:18 is when it says he's warming himself by the fire. The very first thing that happens has to be John brings Peter in. John 18:16. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then went out that other disciple, which was known to the high priest, and spoke to her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Okay, where it says, and brought in Peter, that's what I have to combine with Matthew and Mark and Luke. So just Matthew and Mark. And went in and sat with the servants. So sometime during this event of being brought in by the woman, going in, maybe even being escorted by the woman, maybe not, maybe just the door was opened by her, and then by the time he sat down is when he's questioned, because in John is where it says she asked him. Yeah, then says the damsel that kept the door, are not you also one of this man's disciples? That's the first question. Luke has they kindled a fire and were set down together. Peter sat down, but a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire and earnestly looked upon him. So he's already at the fire, and she's earnestly looking at him, and then she says this man was also with him. I know that statement, this man was also with him, could sound like she's not saying it to him but to others, but I'm going to keep it as a direct question the way it says in John. Are not you also one of this man's disciples? Mark, he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Then it goes into Jesus. I'm skipping all that. And as Peter was beneath in the palace, there's a higher place where Jesus is, but Peter and the rest of the servants by the fire are beneath, some place lower, at a fire. There comes one of the maids of the high priest. So this woman, who is the damsel that kept the door, is a maid of the high priest. Matthew, he went in, sat with the servants at this lower place, warming himself by the fire. Skip all that happened to Jesus and Matthew. (69) Now Peter sat outside in the palace. So it's still within the property, not in the building, outside, warming himself by the fire because it's cold. A damsel came to him. This is the same woman, doorkeeper, saying, you also were with Jesus of Galilee. And brought in Peter. What exactly does brought in? Does that mean escorted all the way to the fire? I think it just means opens the door. And it skips the fact that he goes to the fire, skips the fact that she's earnestly looking upon him like it says in Luke, and just goes right to the question. Then says, the damsel that kept the door to Peter, are not you also one of this man's disciples? So before the question, and he sat. Matthew has and went in. So is she bringing him in or is he going in? They're both the same thing, but her bringing him in is more explanatory. So maybe I can save went for when he sat by the fire. And he went and sat with the servants. And warmed himself at the fire. Yeah, that's what I can do. I think I have to have when they kindled the fire in the midst of the hall. That's when Peter sat down among them. That's what Luke says. When they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. Then the woman questioned him. So that's where I'll have Peter went. So this in I'll combine from Matthew. Because I'll use and went, but I'm not going to have in later. First, Luke, the timing. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter now went. So I'll use the and from earlier in Matthew because I'm not going to use it here. That's the and from Matthew. Now went from Matthew. I already used the in. Now from Mark, and he sat with the servants. And he sat. Oh wait, that and the word sat is also in Matthew. And the word sat is in Luke. So and is Matthew and Mark. Sat is all three. There is a bit of a problem because when he's questioned in John, then says the damsel that kept the door to Peter, so he could be sitting at this time, are not you also one of this man's disciples? He says, I'm not. Then verse 18, and the servants and the officers stood there who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Is he sitting by a fire here? And then standing by a fire later? That could be. Is he standing by a different fire? I don't see any reason to believe that other than just he's sitting by a fire and standing by a fire. He's probably at the same fire, just sitting before the question, then standing after the question. However, there's not a reason to mention that he's at a fire warming and they're warming themselves. Twice. Here it says, when they had kindled the fire in the midst of the hall. Later, I would have to say again, the servants and the officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold. I need to combine this fire and only mention it once, even though it comes after the question in John. You know what? Instead of just they had kindled the fire, I guess that's where I'll put in the servants and officers stood there. Yeah. But it's when from Luke. Maybe I can say the servants and the officers kindled a fire and when they made the fire, then Peter went and sat with them. Because here in John, the fire's already made, and they're standing. In Luke, it's like the beginning of the fire, when they had kindled a fire, and were sat down, Peter went and sat down with them. Versus John, it's already done. The fire's already there. It's cold. They're standing there. Maybe I'll save, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself for after the question. Yeah, I'm going to have to do that, because he's clearly sitting earlier than the question, then standing after the question. Peter sat down among them. Yeah, let me just add among them before I do any reordering. Matthew says, sat with the servants. Mark is sat with the servants. Luke is sat down among them. I think among them should come first. Sat down among them with the servants. Or among the servants. That's what it needs to be. Matthew has to see the end. Mark, and warmed himself at the fire. I'll have and warmed himself from John combined here. So both Mark and John, and warmed himself, and then just Mark at the fire. Peter stood and warmed himself, and there's no mention of a second fire, so I'm gonna just believe he came back. I don't need to say for it was cold. I'll just mention that earlier when they first made the fire. Peter went and sat himself down among the servants and warmed himself at the fire, for it was cold. Yeah, at the end, that's where it needs to be. Another thing I forgot is the rest of the location as mentioned, where Peter is when he's first questioned. Matthew and Mark have that many verses later because it goes through everything Jesus encountered then, where Peter is and he's questioned. That's Matthew 26:69. Now Peter sat outside in the palace, and a damsel came to him saying, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." So outside in the palace, that should be mentioned here. Mark 14:66. And as Peter was beneath in the palace. Matthew says outside, Mark says beneath. So I guess this is fine. There's probably an outer wall. That's where the door is that the doorkeeper let him in. But it's still outside the inner building. The whole place is probably the palace. So then where to mention outside? I think it should be here. Kindle the fire outside in the palace. If I keep in the palace close to outside, it may help with the understanding that this is a different kind of outside. This isn't outside in the same sense that Peter was before he was brought in. It's still in the palace where Peter just was brought into. When they had kindled the fire outside in the palace, in the midst of the hall. So they're definitely in the palace, in the hall, outside of the most inner place. I don't know how to put this beneath. So this is what it reads now. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then went out that other disciple which was known to the high priest and spoke to her that kept the door and brought in Peter. When they had kindled the fire outside in the palace, amidst the hall, and were set down together, Peter went and sat down among the servants and warmed himself at the fire, for it was cold.